Alright guys, let's do some daily reading. Book 6. Virtues of Thought. 1. The mean and the virtues of thought. Since we have said previously that we must choose the intermediate condition, not the excess or the deficiency, and that the intermediate condition is as correct reason says, let us now determine what it says. For in all the states of character we have mentioned, as well as in the others, there is a target that the person who has reason focuses on and so tightens or relaxes, and there is a definition of the means, which we say are between excess and deficiency, because they accord with the correct reason. To say this is admittedly true, but it is not at all clear. For in other pursuits directed by a science, it is equally true that we must labor and be idle, neither too much nor too little, but the intermediate amount prescribed by correct reason. But knowing only this, we would know nothing more about, for instance, the medicines to be applied to the body. If we were told we must apply the ones that medical science prescribes, and in the way that the medical scientist applies them. That is why our account of the states of the soul in the same way must not only be true as far as it has gone, we must also determine what the correct reason is, that is to say, what its definition is. After we divided the virtues of the soul, we said that some are virtues of character and some of thought. And so, having finished our discussion of the virtues of character, let us now discuss others as follows. After speaking first about the soul. Previously, then, we said there are two parts of the soul, one that has reason and one non-rational. Now we should divide in the same way the part that has reason. Let us assume there are two parts that have reason. With one we study beings whose principles do not admit of being otherwise than they are, and with the other we study beings whose principles admit of being otherwise. For if the beings are of different kinds, the parts of the soul naturally suited to each of them are also of different kinds, since the parts possess knowledge by being somehow similar and appropriate to their objects. Let us call one of these parts the scientific part, and the other the rationally calculating part. For deliberating is the same as rationally calculating, and no one deliberates about what cannot be otherwise. Hence, the rationally calculating part is one part of the soul that has reason. Hence, we should find the best state of the scientific part and the best state of the rationally calculating part, for the state is the virtue of each of them. Now, a thing's virtue is relative to its own proper function, and so we must consider the function of each part. 2. Thought, desire, and decision. There are three capacities in the soul: sense perception, understanding, desire, that control action and truth. Of these three, sense perception is clearly not the principle of any action, since beasts have perception, but no share in action. As assertion and denial are to thought, so pursuit and avoidance are to desire. Now, virtue of character is a state that decides, and decision is a deliberative desire. If, then, the decision is excellent, the reason must be true and the desire correct, so that what reason asserts is what desire pursues. This, then, is thought and truth concerned with action. The thought concerned with study, not with action or production, has its good or bad state in being true or false. For truth is the function of whatever thinks, but the function of what thinks about action is truth agreeing with correct desire. Now the principle of an action, the source of motion, not the goal, is decision. But the principle of decision is desire and goal-directed reason. That is why decision requires understanding and thought, and also a state of character, for acting well or badly requires both thought and character. Thought by itself moves nothing, but goal-directed thought concerned with action moves us. For this thought is also the principle of productive thought, for every producer in producing aims at some further goal, and the unqualified goal is not the product, which is only the qualified goal of some production, and aims at some further goal. An unqualified goal is what we achieve in action, since acting well is the goal and desire is for the goal. That is why decision is either understanding combined with desire or desire combined with thought. And this is the sort of principle that a human being is. We do not decide to do what is already past. No one decides, for instance, to have sacked Troy, for neither do we deliberate about what is past, but only about what will be and admits of being or not being. And what is past does not admit of not having happened. That is why agathon is correct to say, of this alone even a god is deprived to make what is all done to have never happened. The function of each of the understanding parts, then, is truth, and so the virtues of each part would be the states that best direct it towards the truth. 3. Scientific knowledge. Then let us begin again and discuss the states of the soul. Let us say, then, that there are 5 states in which the soul grasps the truth in its affirmation or denials. These are craft, scientific knowledge, prudence, wisdom, and understanding. For belief and supposition admit of being false. What science is evident from the following. If we ought to speak exactly and not be guided by mere similarities, for we all suppose that what we know scientifically does not even admit of being otherwise, but whenever what admits of being otherwise escapes observation, we do not notice whether it is or is not, and hence we do not know about it. Hence what is known scientifically is by necessity, hence it is everlasting, for the things that are by unqualified necessity are all everlasting, and everlasting things are ingenerable and indestructible. Further, every science seems to be teachable, and what is scientifically knowable is learnable, but all teaching is from what is already known, as we also say in the analytics, for some teaching is through induction and some by deduction, which both require previous knowledge. Induction leads to the principle, that is, the universal, but deduction proceeds from the universal. Hence, deduction has principles from which it proceeds and which are not reached by deduction. Hence, they are reached by induction. Scientific knowledge, then, is a demonstrative state, and has all the other features that in the analytics we add to the definition. For one has scientific knowledge whenever one has the appropriate sort of confidence, and knows the principles. For if one does not know them better than the conclusion, one will have scientific knowledge only coincidentally. So much for a definition of scientific knowledge. 4. Craft knowledge. What admits of being otherwise includes what is produced and what is achieved in action. Production and action are different. About them we rely also on our popular discussions. Therefore, the state involving reason and concerned with action is different from the state involving reason and concerned with production. Nor is one included in the other, for action is not production, and production is not action. Now, building, for instance, is a craft, and is essentially a certain state involving reason concerned with production. There is no craft that is not a state involving reason concerned with production, and no such state that is not a craft. Hence, a craft is the same as a state involving true reason concerned with production. Every craft is concerned with coming to be, and the exercise of the craft is the study of how something that admits of being and not being comes to be, something whose principle is in the producer and not in the product. For a craft is not concerned with things that are or come to be by necessity, nor with things that are by nature, since these have their principle in themselves. Since production and action are different, craft must be concerned with production, not with action. In a way, craft and fortune are concerned with the same things, as Agathon says, craft was fond of fortune, and fortune of craft. A craft, then, as we have said, is a state involving true reason concerned with production. Lack of craft is the contrary state involving false reason and concerned with production. Both are concerned with what admits of being otherwise. 5. Prudence. To grasp what prudence is, we should first study the sort of people we call prudent. It seems proper to a prudent person to be able to deliberate finally about things that are good and beneficial for himself, not about some restricted area, about what sorts of things are means to health or strength, for instance, but about what sorts of things are means to living well altogether. A sign of this is the fact that we call people prudent about some restricted area whenever they calculate well about means to some excellent end, in an area where there is no craft. Hence, where living well as a whole is concerned, the deliberative person will also be prudent. Now, no one deliberates about things that cannot be otherwise, or about things that cannot be achieved in his action. Hence, if science involves demonstration, but there is no demonstration of anything whose principles admit of being otherwise, since every such thing admits of being otherwise, and if we cannot deliberate about things that are by necessity, it follows that prudence is not science, nor yet craft knowledge. It is not science, because what is achievable in action admits of being otherwise, and it is not craft knowledge, because action and production belong to different kinds. The remaining possibility, then, is that prudence is a state of grasping the truth, involving reason, concerned with action, about things that are good or bad for a human being. For production has its end in something other than itself, but action does not, since its end is acting well itself. That is why Pericles and such people are the ones whom we regard as prudent, because they are able to study what is good for themselves and for human beings. We think that household managers and politicians are such people. This is also how we come to give temperance its name, because we think that it preserves prudence. It preserves the appropriate sort of supposition. For the sort of supposition that is corrupted and perverted by the pleasant or painful is not every sort, not, for instance, the supposition that the triangle does or does not have two right angles, but suppositions about what is achievable in action. For the principles of things achievable in action are the end for the sake of which we act. But if someone is corrupted because of pleasure or pain, no appropriate principle can appear to him, and it cannot appear that this is the end, nor that for the sake of this and because of this one ought to choose and perform every action, for vice corrupts the principle, and so prudence must be a state grasping the truth, involving reason, and concerned with action about human goods. Moreover, there is virtue or vice in the use of craft, but not in the use of prudence. Further, in a craft, someone who makes errors voluntarily is more choiceworthy, but with prudence, as with the virtues, the reverse is true. Clearly, then, prudence is a virtue, not a craft. There are two parts of the soul that have reason. Prudence is a virtue of one of them, of the part that has belief, for belief is concerned as prudence is with what admits of being otherwise. Moreover, it is not only a state involving reason. A sign of this is the fact that such a state can be forgotten, but prudence cannot. 6. Understanding. Scientific knowledge is supposition about universals, things that are by necessity. Further, everything demonstrable and every science have principles, since scientific knowledge involves reason. Hence there can be neither scientific knowledge nor craft knowledge nor prudence about the principles of what is scientifically known. For what is scientifically known is demonstrable, but principles are not, and craft and prudence are about things that admit of being otherwise, nor is wisdom exclusively about principles. For it is proper to the wise person to have a demonstration of some things, the states of the soul, by which we always grasp the truth and never make mistakes, about things that can be otherwise, or those that cannot be otherwise, are scientific knowledge, prudence, wisdom, and understanding. But none of the first three, prudence, scientific knowledge, wisdom, is possible about principles. The remaining possibility, then, is that understanding is about principles. 7. Wisdom contrasted with prudence. We ascribe wisdom in crafts to the people who have the most exact expertise in the crafts. For example, we call Phaedius a wise stoneworker and Polycletus a wise bronze worker, and by wisdom we signify precisely virtue in a craft. But we also think some people are wise in general, not wise in some restricted area or in some other specific way, as Homer says in the Margites. The gods did not make him a digger, or a plowman, or wise in anything else. Clearly, then, wisdom is the most exact form of scientific knowledge. Hence, the wise person must not only know what is derived from the principles of a science, but also grasp the truth about the principles. Therefore, wisdom is understanding plus scientific knowledge. It is scientific knowledge of the most honorable things that has received understanding as its coping stone. For it would be absurd for someone to think that political science or prudence is the most excellent science. For the best thing in the universe is not a human being, and the most excellent science must be of the best things. Moreover, if what is good and healthy for human beings and for fish is not the same, whereas what is white or straight is always the same, everyone would also say that the content of wisdom is the same in every case, but the content of prudence is not. For the agent they would call prudent is the one who studies well each question about his own good, and he is the one to whom they would entrust such questions. That is why prudence is also ascribed to some of the beasts, the ones that are evidently capable of forethought about their own life. It is also evident that wisdom is not the same as political science, for if people are to say that science about what is beneficial to themselves as human beings counts as wisdom, there will be many types of wisdom, corresponding to the different species of animals. For if there is no one medical science about all beings, there is no one science about the good of all animals, but a different science about each specific good. It does not matter if human beings are the best among the animals, for there are other beings of a far more divine nature than human beings, most evidently, for instance, the beings composing the universe. What we have said makes it clear that wisdom is both scientific knowledge and understanding about the things that are by nature most honorable. That is why people say that Anaxagoras or Thales or that sort of person is wise, but not prudent, whenever they see that he is ignorant of what benefits himself, and so they say that what he knows is extraordinary, amazing, difficult, and divine, but useless, because it is not human goods that he looks for. Prudence, by contrast, is about human concerns, about things open to deliberation. For we say that deliberating well is the function of the prudent person more than anyone else. But no one deliberates about things that cannot be otherwise, or about things lacking any goal that is a good achievable in action. The unqualifiedly good deliberator is the one whose aim accords with rational calculation in pursuit of the best good that is achievable in action for a human being. Nor is prudence about universals only. It must also acquire knowledge of particulars, since it is concerned with action, and action is about particulars. That is why in other areas, also some people who lack knowledge but have experience are better in action than others who have knowledge. For someone who knows that light meats are digestible and hence healthy, but not which sorts of meats are light, will not produce health. Rather, the one who knows that bird meats are light and healthy will be better at producing health, and since prudence is concerned with action, it must possess both the universal and the particular knowledge, or the particular more than the universal. Here too, however, as in medicine, there is a ruling science. 8. Types of prudence. Political science and prudence are the same state, but their being is not the same. One type of prudence about the city is the ruling part. This is legislative science. The type concerned with particulars is given the name political science that is common to both types. This type is concerned with action and deliberation, since the decree is to be acted on as the last thing reached in deliberation. That is why only these people are said to be politically active, for only these put political science into practice, as handcraftsmen put a craft into practice. Similarly, prudence concerned with the individual himself seems most of all to be counted as prudence, and this type of prudence is given the name prudence that is common to all types Of the other types, one is household science, another legislative, another political, one type of which is deliberative and another judicial. In fact, knowledge of what is good for oneself is one species of prudence, but there is much difference in opinions about it. The one who knows about himself and spends his time on his own concerns seems to be prudent, while politicians seem to be too active. Hence, Euripides says, "Surely I cannot be prudent, since I could have been inactive, numbered among all the many in the army, and have had an equal share. For those who go too far and are too active, for people seek what is good for themselves, and suppose that this inactivity is the right action to achieve their good. Hence, this belief has led to the view that these are the prudent people. Presumably, however, one's own welfare requires household management and a political system." Further, another reason for the difference of opinion is that it is unclear and should be examined how one must manage one's own affairs. A sign of what has been said is the fact that whereas young people become accomplished in geometry and mathematics and wise, within these limits, prudent young people do not seem to be found. The reason is that prudence is concerned with particulars as well as universals, and particulars become known from experience. But a young person lacks experience, since some length of time is needed to produce it. Indeed, we might also consider why a child can become accomplished in mathematics, but not in wisdom or natural science. Is it because mathematical objects are reached through abstraction, but in these other cases the principles are reached from experience? Young people, then, have no real conviction in these other sciences, but only say the words, whereas the nature of mathematical objects is clear to them. Further, deliberation may be in error about either the universal or the particular, for we may wrongly suppose either that all sorts of heavy water are bad, or that this water is heavy. It is apparent that prudence is not scientific knowledge, for, as we said, it concerns the last thing, that is, the particular, since this is what is achievable in action. Hence, it is opposite to understanding, for understanding is about the first terms, those that have no account of them. But prudence is about the last thing, an object of perception, not of science. This is not the perception of special objects, but the sort by which we perceive that the last among mathematical objects is a triangle, for it will stop there too. This is another species of perception than perception of special objects, but it is still perception more than prudence is. 9. Good deliberation. Inquiry and deliberation are different. Since deliberation is a type of inquiry, we must also grasp what good deliberation is, and see whether it is some sort of scientific knowledge or belief or good guessing, or some other kind of thing. First of all, then, it is not scientific knowledge, for we do not inquire for what we already know, but good deliberation is a type of deliberation, and a deliberator inquires and rationally calculates. Moreover, it is not good guessing either, for good guessing involves no reason and is done quickly, but we deliberate a long time, and it is said that we must act quickly on the results of our deliberation, but deliberate slowly. Further, quick thinking is different from good deliberation, and quick thinking is a kind of good guessing. Nor is good deliberation just any sort of belief. Rather, since the bad deliberator is in error, and the good deliberator deliberates correctly, good deliberation is clearly some sort of correctness. But it is not correctness in scientific knowledge or in belief, for there is no correctness in scientific knowledge, since there is no error in it either, and correctness in belief consists in truth. Further, everything about which one has belief is already determined. However, good deliberation requires reason, hence the remaining possibility is that it belongs to thought, for thought is not yet assertion, and this is why it is not belief, for belief is not inquiry, but already an assertion. But in deliberating, either well or badly, we inquire for something and rationally calculate about it. But good deliberation is a certain sort of correctness in deliberation. That is why we must first inquire what this correctness is and what it is correctness about. Since there are several types of correctness, clearly good deliberation will not be every type, For the incontinent or base person will use rational calculation to reach what he proposes to see, and so will have deliberated correctly, but will have got himself a great evil. Having deliberated well, however, seems to be some sort of good, for the sort of correctness in deliberation that makes it good, deliberation is the sort that reaches a good. However, we can reach a good by a false inference, as well as by correct deliberation, so that we reach the right thing to do, but by the wrong steps, when the middle term is false. Hence, neither is this type of deliberation, leading us by the wrong steps to the right thing to do, enough for good deliberation. Further, one person may deliberate a long time before reaching the right thing to do, while another reaches it quickly. Nor, then, is the first condition enough for good deliberation. Good deliberation is correctness that accords with what is beneficial, about the right thing, in the right way, and at the right time. Further, our deliberation may be either good without qualification, or good only to the extent that it is a means to some limited end. Hence, unqualifiedly, good deliberation is the sort that is a correct means to promote the unqualified end, that is, the highest good, while the limited sort is the sort that is a correct means to some limited end. If, then, having deliberated well is proper to a prudent person, good deliberation will be the type of correctness that accords with what is expedient as a means to the end about which prudence is true supposition. 10. Comprehension. Comprehension, that is, good comprehension, makes people, as we say, comprehend and comprehend well. It is not the same as scientific knowledge in general, nor is it the same as belief, since if it were, everyone would have comprehension, nor is it any one of the specific sciences. In the way that medicine is about what is healthy, or geometry is about magnitudes, for comprehension is neither about what always is and is unchanging, nor about just anything that comes to be. It is about what we might be puzzled. It is about what we might be puzzled about and might deliberate about. That is why it is about the same things as prudence, but not the same as prudence. For prudence is prescriptive, since its end is what action we ought or ought not to do, but comprehension only judges, for comprehension and good comprehension are the same. For, similarly, people with comprehension and with good comprehension are the same. Comprehension is neither having prudence nor acquiring it. Rather, it is similar to the way learning is called comprehending when someone applies scientific knowledge. In the same way, comprehension consists in the application of belief to judge someone else's remarks on a question that concerns prudence, and moreover, it must judge them finely, since judging well is the same as judging finely. That is how the name comprehension was attached to the comprehension that makes people have good comprehension. It is derived from the comprehension that takes place in learning, for we often call learning comprehending. 11. Practical thought and particulars. The state called consideration makes people, as we say, considerate, and makes them have consideration. It is the correct judgment of the decent person. A sign of this is our saying that the decent person, more than others, is considerate, and that it is decent to be considerate about some things. Considerateness is the correct consideration that judges what is decent, and correct consideration judges what is true. It is reasonable that all these states tend in the same direction, for we ascribe consideration, comprehension, prudence, and understanding to the same people, and say that these have consideration and thereby understanding, and that they are prudent and comprehending. For all these capacities are about the last things, that is, particulars. Moreover, someone has comprehension and good consideration, or has considerateness, in being able to judge about the matters that concern the prudent person, for the decent is the common concern of all good people in relations with other people. Now, all the things achievable in action are particular and last things, for the prudent person also must recognize things achievable in action, while comprehension and consideration are concerned with things achievable in action, and these are last things. Understanding is also concerned with the last things, and in both directions. For there is understanding, not a rational count, both about the first terms and about the last. In demonstrations, understanding is about the unchanging terms that are first. In premises, about action, understanding is about the last term, the one that admits of being otherwise, and hence about the minor premise, for these last terms are beginnings of the end to be aimed at. Since universals are reached from particulars, we must therefore have perception of these particulars, and this perception is understanding. That is why understanding is both beginning and end, for demonstrations begin from these things and are about them. That is why these states actually seem to grow naturally, so that whereas no one seems to have natural wisdom, people seem to have natural consideration, comprehension, and judgment. A sign of their apparent natural character is our thinking that they also correspond to someone's age, and the fact that understanding and consideration belongs to a certain age, as though nature were the cause. That is why about them, and so we must attend to the undemonstrated remarks and beliefs of experienced and older people, or of prudent people, no less than to demonstrations. For these people see correctly because experience has given them their eye. We have said, then, what prudence and wisdom are, what each is about, and that each is the virtue of a different part of the soul. 12. Puzzles about prudence and wisdom. One might, however, go through some puzzles about what use they are, for wisdom is not concerned with any sort of coming into being, and hence will not study any source of human happiness. Admittedly, prudence will study this, but what do we need it for? For knowledge of what is healthy or fit, that is, of what results from the state of health, not of what produces it, makes us no readier to act appropriately if we are already healthy. For having the science of medicine or gymnastics makes us no readier to act appropriately. Similarly, prudence is the science of what is just and what is fine, and what is good for a human being. But this is how the good man acts, and if we are already good, knowledge of them makes us no readier to act appropriately, since virtues are states. If we concede that prudence is not useful for this, should we say it is useful for becoming good? In that case, it will be no use to those who are already excellent. Nor, however, will it be any use to those who are not, for it will not matter to them whether they have it themselves or take the advice of others who have it. The advice of others will be quite adequate for us, just as it is with health, for we wish to be healthy, but still do not learn medical science. Besides, it would seem absurd for prudence, inferior as it is to wisdom, to control it, for the science that produces also rules and prescribes about each thing. We must discuss these questions, for so far we have only raised the puzzles about them. First of all, let us state that both prudence and wisdom must be choice-worthy in themselves, even if neither produces anything at all, for each is the virtue of one of the two rational parts of the soul. Secondly, they do produce something. Wisdom produces happiness, not in the way that medical science produces health, but in the way that health produces health. For since wisdom is a part of virtue as a whole, it makes us happy because it is a state that we possess and activate. Further, we fulfill our function insofar as we have prudence and virtue of character. For virtue makes the goal correct, and prudence makes the means to it correct. The fourth part of the soul, the nutritive part, has no such virtue, since no action is up to it to do or not to do. To answer the claim that prudence will make us no better at achieving fine and just actions, we must begin from a little further back in our discussion. We begin here. We say that some people who do just actions are not yet thereby just. If, for instance, they do the actions prescribed by the laws, either unwillingly or because of ignorance, or because of some other end, not because of the actions themselves, even though they do the right actions, those that the excellent person ought to do. Equally, however, it would seem to be possible for someone to do each type of action in the state that makes him a good person. That is to say, because of decision and for the sake of the actions themselves, virtue therefore makes the decision correct. But the actions that are naturally to be done to fulfill the decision do not belong to virtue, but to another capacity. We must grasp them more perspicuously before continuing our discussion. There is a capacity called cleverness, which is such as to be able to do the actions that are means to the goal that is assumed, and to attain them. If, then, the goal is fine, cleverness is praiseworthy, and if the goal is base, cleverness is unscrupulousness. That is why both prudent and unscrupulous people are called clever. Now, prudence is not cleverness, though not without this capacity. But prudence, this eye of the soul, acquires its state only with virtue, as we have said, and as is clear, for inferences about actions have a principle, since the end and the best good is this sort of thing. Whatever it actually is, let it be any old thing for the sake of argument, and this best good is not apparent, except to the good person. For vice perverts us and produces false views about the principles of actions. Evidently, then, we cannot be prudent without being good. 13. Prudence and virtue of character. We must then also examine virtue over again. For virtue is similar in this way to prudence, as prudence is related to cleverness, not the same but similar. So natural virtue is related to full virtue, for each of us seems to possess his type of character to some extent by nature. For we are just, brave, prone to temperance, or have another feature, immediately from birth. But still, we look for some further condition to be full goodness, and we expect these features to belong to us in another way. For these natural states belong to children, and to beasts as well as to adults. But without understanding, they are evidently harmful. At any rate, this much would seem to be clear, just as a heavy body moving around, unable to see, suffers a heavy fall because it has no sight. So it is with virtue. But if someone acquires understanding, he improves in his actions and the state he now has, though still similar to the natural condition, will be fully virtue. And so, just as in the part of the soul that has belief, there are two sorts of conditions, cleverness and prudence. So also there are two in the part that has character, natural virtue and full virtue. And of these full virtue cannot be acquired without prudence. That is why some say that all the virtues are cases of prudence, and why the inquiries Socrates used to undertake were in one way correct and in another way in error. For insofar as he thought all the virtues are cases of prudence, he was in error. But insofar as he thought they all require prudence, what he used to say was right. Here is a sign of this. Whenever people now define virtue, they all say what state it is, and what it is related to, and then add that it is the state in accord with correct reason. Now the correct reason is the reason in accord with prudence. It would seem, then, that they all in a way intuitively believe that the state in accord with prudence is virtue. But we must make a slight change, for it is not merely the state in accord with the correct reason, but the state involving the correct reason, that is virtue, and it is prudence that is correct reason in this area. Socrates, then, used to think the virtues are cases of reason, because he thought they are all cases of knowledge, but we think they involve reason. What we have said, then, makes it clear that we cannot be fully good without prudence, or prudent without virtue of character. And in this way, we can also solve the dialectical argument that someone might use to show that the virtues are separated from one another. For, it is argued, since the same person is not naturally best suited for all the virtues, someone will already have one virtue before he has got another. This is indeed possible in the case of the natural virtues. It is not possible, however, in the case of the full virtues, that someone must have to be called good without qualification. For one has all the virtues if and only if one has prudence, which is a single state. And it is clear that even if prudence were useless in action, we would need it because it is the virtue of this part of the soul, and because the decision will not be correct without prudence or without virtue. For virtue makes us achieve the end, whereas prudence makes us achieve the means to the end. Moreover, prudence does not control wisdom or the better part of the soul, just as medical science does not control health, for medical science does not use health but only aims to bring health into being. Hence, it prescribes for the sake of health, but does not prescribe to health. Besides, saying that prudence controls wisdom would be like saying that political science rules the gods because it prescribes about everything in the city. That is the end of Book 6.